Welcome to our podcast, Real Life Live Bible Topics, Questions and Answers. Our topic of the evening is modern day slavery and discriminatory abuse will be our next segment. But today we'll be discussing modern day slavery. I'm your host, Shapronica Long, with Ricky Long, and our panel members are Dewana Wendell, Tanya Carter, and myself and Ricky as well. Guest speaker today, we have MICHELE TRAMPE. And she is Executive Director of Central Virginia Justice Initiative. Our call line to call in live is 256-669-9565. Again, our call line is 256-669-9565. Okay, so we want to discuss our topic today. I do have just a small little thing I would like to mention. Inaccurate interpretations of the Bible have caused a misconception that God approves of slavery and racism. God created each of us worthy and cares about each one of us, regardless of race, color, or creed. It is very clear in the scripture that all of us are made in the image of God and in his likeness. Okay, so MICHELE, thank you for joining us today. And I want you to tell us a little bit about modern day slavery.
Okay. Well, thank you. And you couldn't have actually introduced this topic any better. The Central Virginia Justice Initiative, we're a Christian faith-based nonprofit who is fighting human trafficking in the Central Virginia region. And we really base our work on what we're called to do. And so in Deuteronomy, we're told that God shows no partiality or takes a bribe. He administers justice to the fatherless and the widow, and loves the stranger, giving him food and clothing. And so that's really the basis of what we feel we're called to do, because we know we're called to imitate that. And
yes.
So I thought I would give you a brief overview of human trafficking and how it happens, and also what we're specifically seeing. But certainly feel free to ask me questions. I'll stop talking. If I don't, you stop me, and I'll be happy. So a lot of times, I would like to start with the definition. So it's really a high-level definition. Human trafficking, and Barack Obama called it modern-day slavery, and that's exactly what it is. Human trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to induce another person to perform either commercial sex acts or labor. And so those are the two types that we have here in the United States: commercial sex trafficking or labor trafficking. The only exception to the force, fraud, or coercion, you'll hear me say those three words a lot, is in the case of a minor, someone under the age of 18 who's involved in commercial sex trafficking. And that is, by definition, a victim of human trafficking. But within the last couple of years, we've been actually serving victims of human trafficking. So we sort of have adjusted our mission a little bit. And I think it's important to kind of explain that when we're talking about this definition. When we've been working with clients, we don't really distinguish between commercial sex trafficking and prostitution.
Okay.
Our feeling is that it's all exploitation. But also, as we have worked with our clients, they would normally self-identify as prostitute or as being involved in prostitution or sex work. But after they start dealing with their traumas and kind of pulling apart what has happened to them, they realize the abuse and that they endured, and that forced them into commercial sex trafficking and sex work. So there's probably only been one person that I've come across that where I thought there probably wasn't forced fraud or coercion involved, but it was because of abject poverty, and that was somebody we could help too. So from our organization's perspective, we don't really distinguish between commercial sex trafficking and prostitution. We serve the whole community.
Okay.
Now, again, there are two types of trafficking in the United States: commercial sex trafficking and labor trafficking. In order to meet our mission, there's a couple of things that we do. One is education related. That's raising awareness. We do prevention education, kids, youth, young adults. We do vocational education, because there are certain vocations where, say maybe somebody in healthcare might see certain signs that somebody in a normal or who works in office wouldn't see, or someone who's in the hotel motel industry. So we do that as well. We also did some legislative advocacy type work where we worked with others to educate our legislature here in Virginia. And that resulted in our first standalone human trafficking law passed in 2015. That was not that long ago.
Okay.
Yes. And then we started victim services. At the core of human trafficking, though, it's about someone being willing to exploit another person's vulnerability for profit. And so the two words to really focus on are vulnerability and exploitation.
Okay.
And if you think about our society, we have a lot of vulnerabilities. And it's those vulnerabilities that there are folks, traffickers, who have figured out how to exploit those in folks. And let me give you some examples of the vulnerabilities that we're talking about. In terms of human trafficking, the one that we see most common is someone who is a victim of prior violence and abuse. The second, yes, runaway and homeless youth. And the reason why those two are probably the most prevalent is that when you're talking about, maybe a young person who has been in a situation where they've lived with maybe most of their life in a situation where they've either seen or been subjected to violence and abuse, then when a trafficker comes along and lures them into trafficking and subjects them to violence and abuse, it's normal to them.
Okay.
In terms of runaway and homeless youth, they just run out of resources really, really quickly. And we've had traffickers here. It was actually in a particular gang that they would actually, they knew that there were certain homeless shelters that that runaways would go to get food and resources, and they would hang out there to try to lure them.
Okay.
Other things are financial vulnerability. So if you think about even right now, where we're in the midst of a global pandemic, you have a lot of people who are in a situation of financial vulnerability. So really, that's another one. Drugs. We had one person here. He had a 7-state operation. He's from. I live in the Fredericksburg area. Little Fredericksburg, Virginia, between DC and Richmond. We had a trafficker here. He had a 7-state operation, and he was trafficking women and girls, and they all had a drug dependency. So he would recruit women who had drug dependencies. Now, his drug of choice was heroin. And when they finally were able to get a case and prosecute him, they stopped counting victims at 55. They just ran out of resources, so they stopped counting the number of victims. So this guy had a pretty big operation.
Okay.
Undocumented temporary visa holders, developmental and physically disabled. And if you think about it, if you've worked with those who may be developmentally or physically disabled, a lot of times they're trying to fit in and get a friend. And so those aspects are used, are really preyed upon. In terms of who's trafficked, we've seen all ethnicities, races, classes, gender, that's men, women, adults, children, LGBTQ, foreign nationals, US citizens, documented, undocumented, educated, and uneducated. And it's because the trafficker has figured out what their vulnerability is. And I had one young lady I talked to a couple of weeks ago who we've been helping for about a year. And she said, he caught me at my weakest. And I think we've all had periods in our lives where, for whatever reason, we were really vulnerable. And this guy just, got her at her weakest. So how the traffickers recruit is they usually try to use a type of lure. The number one lure, shouldn't be surprising to anyone, is the boyfriend or the lover boy lure. So they pose as a boyfriend. And so if you're talking about particularly with teens and younger folks, because the average age is getting younger and younger, they think they have a boyfriend. And particularly if they're coming from a home where there's been violence and abuse, his manipulation, what he subjects them to, isn't that abnormal. The lure usually is, starts out with, he's very nice. He's the Romeo, so to speak, and, maybe buys them things. But, he'll become jealous. He'll try to isolate them. All the things you would normally think an abuser would do. And will get them to think that they are responsible for his financial stability. And they're very crafty at that. So that when there comes a time when he's, I need you to do this because, I bought you all this stuff, this is the way it works. They'll do it because they feel as though they have this obligation. That's kind of a 10,000-foot view of human trafficking. In terms of the traffickers themselves. Really, we tell people not to stereotype what you think a trafficker might look like, because he could look like the guy down the street that runs a business. We had one young lady who she had a heroin dependency, and so her trafficker would make her sit in the corner in the morning, and when she started to go through withdrawal, he would give her her drugs for the day. And it was almost really cruel because he would make her sit there and she started exhibiting, um, looked like she was going into withdrawal. So it was very, very cruel. And what she told me was that his wife ran the legitimate businesses and he ran the illegitimate businesses. And and really just my work with her and others made me realize that, you know, you have to really kind of throw out any preconceived notions you have about this crime and who does it, because it could be anybody.
Yeah.
That's kind of 10,000 foot view again of human trafficking. But I guess I wanted to ask if you have questions. I'm happy to answer those questions.
So I had a question. When you said that they recruit them, so if they're being recruited, are they necessarily going voluntarily? You know, the victim, are they voluntarily going? And how is that viewed? I know we talked earlier, you said the difference between sex trafficking and prostitution. How is that? How do you view that?
Okay. The recruitment is a lure, and they do it different ways. One lure that's that's pretty common, maybe starts on social media. So if you think about if the target's a child, they're on social media. Maybe you have a child from a home that they have a lot of extra time and nobody's really watching to see what they're doing. And they are, maybe they're at that 13, 14-year age that maybe they don't have a lot of confidence. And so this person on the other side of the computer tells them they're beautiful, tells them they're, that they care about them. And the one thing is that they're incredibly, these traffickers, these people who do this are incredibly patient. So they'll recruit them over many months until maybe something happens and they can get them to go with them. And then once they have them, that's it. Others, we had something here, I think it was maybe last December. We had a skip party here that a mother, she's my hero, broke up. Her daughter had gone to school. She dropped her daughter off at school. And one of her daughter's friends, somebody who'd been friends with her for a long time, contacted her mother and said, your daughter's not at school today. And so through social media, she was able to figure out where her daughter was. Her daughter was actually in a trailer park in another county. Now, this is really close to the city, so it was probably maybe 5-6 miles, so it wasn't that far. And so she called the police and went there, knocked on the door and said, my daughter's there. And of course, the guy comes out and says, no, she's not. And then she says, well, I've called the police. And then all these kids file out of the back of the trailer. They had been giving them alcohol. There was one child who looked like she maybe was on more than alcohol. I think the average age was 14, 15 years old. There might have been maybe one or two younger than that. They had started giving them nicknames. And one of the people in this, one of the men, there were 3 men, one of the men had a connection to an international gang. And so, you know, giving the giving of nicknames is part of the lore. But also they had a talk with them about, you know, they're about, you know, not talking to people about what happens here. There's that loyalty. They started talking to them about loyalty. So all the things that you would normally think of in terms of a lot of times gangs do that. The one thing I know though about this particular gang is that they don't have female gang members. There's one thing that they do with their gang members. With that, there's a lot of pressure. Now this particular skip party, because it was during during school and kids were skipping school, that's why it's called a skip party. They were able to break it up and you know, prosecute. And so that's why I say this mother is my hero. She called me the next day, and it happened to be somebody I know. And you know, she and I met at a Starbucks, and we prayed right there in the middle of Starbucks. I was so grateful. But they're really crafty in the way that they lure. It could be a guy at the mall who meets a girl, but they're really crafty at it. And so again, if it's somebody who's under the age of 18, then it's automatically human trafficking. Somebody over the age of 18, you really have to demonstrate force, fraud, or coercion. But the reason why fraud and coercion were added and added to the trafficking, there's a law, 20 years, Trafficking Victims Prevention Act of 2000, recognized that it's not just force that causes someone to be trafficked or put somebody in a trafficking situation, but also fraud and coercion. So, you know, while they may go with them, if coercion or fraud has been applied, then that is part of the whole trafficking. You know, that's part of trafficking too. You have to have somebody then willing to testify, and sometimes that's difficult to do as well, because you know, these folks just want to be away from the situation. Sometimes they don't, but you know, if it's kind of a fine line, but anybody who's 18 or over, there has to be that element of coercion, force, fraud, or coercion. And so some of this really is coercion, but you know, it's sometimes hard to prove. Did that answer your question? I'm sorry.
Yes, it did.
Okay.
I have a question. How often is it under the age of 18 versus adults?
You know, the average age of entry into forced prostitution, depending upon whose statistics you want to believe, could be 12 to 14. Somewhere in that age range, 12 to 14, 15, something like that. From our personal experience, a lot of times we're running into these folks when they're not minors anymore, but as we work with them and we hear their stories, most of them, really their situation starts well before the age of 18. So, for example, there was a young lady that I got a call from our sheriff's office, and they said, we kind of need your help. they weren't going to charge this woman, but they recognized her as a human trafficking victim, and they wanted to see if we can help get her to a shelter. So we were saying, sure. So we, showed up. It's 11:30 at night. Very few options at that point, so we were able to get her someplace. But over the time that we worked with her, one of the things that she mentioned was that her trafficking situation started at the age of 12, and her mother was her first pimp. And if you think about that, what chance did she have? And just brace your heart. I mean, what chance did that little 12-year-old have? And of course, she's an adult now, and she has a heroin addiction. Well, of course she does. She's using that drug to self-medicate, basically. And yeah, exactly. And so, but what the world saw, and I was actually really pleased to see that the sheriff's office looked beyond that, because a lot of times it doesn't happen, but we're getting more and more training, so sometimes it is. And what I was glad to see is they looked beyond that, and they saw that, this is somebody who really was a victim, and somebody who needed assistance. And it wasn't, whereas a lot of times the world sees that person and they see drug addict and they see prostitute. And then they don't look anymore. And a lot of what we try to tell people is, you have to look beyond that. You have to really invest in the person. We have one young lady we've been working with, I think, over a year. I met her for lunch this week, and she said, I've been working with you guys for over a year now. And I'm like, yeah, I guess we have, but you have to really invest in that person, whether they're wherever they are. And it's the non-judgmental type of investment. When I first met her, and a lot of times these folks have difficulty, really a lot of difficulty trusting, because let's just be honest, the system hasn't worked well for them. The system has left them behind. It hasn't worked well for them. And so, when they come see me, 50-plus-year-old woman, why should they? Why should they trust me? And it's interesting, because the longer we work with a person, the more that they will share. But I remember this one young lady telling me, told me something, but I could tell she was holding back. Well, 6 months later, she tells me the whole story. And she said, I didn't tell you the whole story before because I thought you would judge me, but now I'll tell you the story because I don't think you're gonna judge me. And I'm like, well, see, we've made some progress, And so, with our folks, it's like what we really try to do is we try to show them, we try to show them as much grace as we possibly can. I mean, and I know you all are believers, and I'll tell you this, is that I am fully and totally unacceptable to God without Christ. Without Christ, I am completely unacceptable to God. So from that perspective, I have no reason to judge another person. I show the grace that I have been shown, and that's what we try to do. And that means you just have to really invest in people. And I really, that's the one thing that has paid off for us, is investing with people. We've had clients, and we actually still have clients that are incarcerated, because a lot of times folks will end up in jail, for drugs, for whatever, sometimes petty theft. But what we'll try to do is make sure that we stay in contact with them, and we're an alternative, because a lot of the prisons, particularly in this area, the women's prison, it's sort of this merry-go-round. The women go in, they go out, and the only person there to pick them up is their pimp, or the person who's selling them, and then they go right back in to jail later. So there's this revolving door, and we can be an alternative to them going back to the pimp or whoever. We can help them find another path. Sometimes it takes multiple tries, but we don't believe that there are any lost causes, because Christ never gave up on me. So
that's right.
We're not
gonna give up on any of us.
Yep. So anyway, so that's kind of how we go about it, and what we see. But it's anyway. So what other questions can I answer?
I don't have a question, but I kind of wanted to make a statement. A lot of times, and I don't know if this is something you guys kind of see a lot, but as for women, a lot of times we're on our phones. When we're coming out of certain locations, we love our phones. So we're walking and talking and not necessarily paying attention. And a lot of times that's how you can be grabbed up. We had the time where there was, they were grabbing people, putting them in the white vans, that became a little popular thing that they were doing. And I can remember coming out of the store last year around Christmas time, and just one of those people walking and talking, running my mouth, not paying attention. And when when I got close to my car, I noticed there were two guys leaning up against my car. And then on the other side, there was another guy standing on the other side. And then next to my car was a white van with the door slid back. So as I'm, let me take my video off. So as I'm approaching, and I noticed, so I kind of stopped, and then they started speaking in another language. And so one of them started, he was walking towards me. So I started walking backwards, and I just started screaming. And I don't know if they were trying to kidnap me or not, but I wasn't going to take any chances. So I started screaming, human trafficking, sex trafficking. I'm screaming to the top of my lungs. And I started flying back towards the store, and they all hopped in the van and pulled off. Now, in my ignorance of just not researching and not being very familiar, I was telling my kids, and my son said, well, they can take down your tag number and follow you home and watch you. He said, so you have to be careful, and you got to stop just walking and talking on your phone and not paying attention to your surroundings. So that, when I say it frightened me so bad. So I always tell my daughters, just be careful of your surroundings. And sometimes we got to get off that phone and pay attention.
That's right.
So it was frightening. It really was. And the fact that they hopped in the van and all, left was an indication of maybe I was correct. And if I wasn't really paying attention and went on and walked through to get in my vehicle, there's no telling what could have happened, but I wasn't taking any chances.
Yeah, I don't know what that was either. It's there's a lot of different types of situations. I will say this, while abduction can happen, we don't see it that often. And the reason why we don't see it that often is that the traffickers they don't want to bring attention to themselves. And particularly with kids, they can get a kid to go with them, particularly if they figure out that the child has, different vulnerabilities. And so they'd rather have the child go with them and not have, have like the Amber Alert and the stuff like that. So they kind of play off of, if a child, say, runs away from home, at least for a while, a lot of times folks thought, oh, that kid just ran away from home. And they didn't necessarily look for them to the same extent that they would a quote unquote abduction. That actually changed a few years ago. And now runaways are getting a lot more attention. So I'm not going to tell you abduction can't happen, because, they try different things. But we haven't seen it. And normally they're going to try to lure somebody, particularly a young person, rather than abducting, because it's less of you don't get the Amber Alert and all the other stuff that happens. So anyway, but yeah, I actually had talked to someone at our sheriff's office, had actually done undercover work for a while in gangs. And he was kind of interesting to talk about because he had stories. And he gave me one example of a gang situation where there were some younger gang members, and it was in a different part of the country, but some younger gang members who wanted to impress older gang members. And so what they did was they saw this woman who was in a parking lot, and she had 2 children. Well, the younger gang members took the 2 kids. Well, of course, what happens is, you get, you just get such an uproar in the community that two children have gone missing. What I was told by this police officer was that they were able to actually recover the children pretty quickly, but the older gang members took their anger out on the younger gang members because it brought more attention to the gang, and they didn't really want that. So, so again, it just depends on the organization and what they're trying to accomplish. But what I was told was that the older gang members really were angry at the younger gang members for doing that because they brought so much attention.
Okay. I just for the victims, it can be, from what I understand, a child, a man, or a woman. Have you ever known of a situation where a man was?
We haven't had any male clients, but I definitely know situations where there have been males who've been trafficked. And I can give you one situation from our area. This person was in and out of foster care, highly abused, in and out of foster care. And when he turned 18, he was living with a foster family, and the foster parents said, we're no longer getting any money for you. And so you're gonna have to, we're going to be, out of the kindness of our heart, we're going to let you live here. But you're going to have to abide by our rules. So you have to be, if school ends at this time, you have to be in the house by this time. So no stopping off to do anything, and you can't give us any trouble, and you have to do this, and this to help in the house. And so they put a lot of rules on this person. Well, of course, the first time that he violated one of the rules, which was getting in a little late, he was kicked out of the house. And so, of course, then he's on the street and he runs into some folks who said, you know, let us introduce you to this guy we know. And you know what, we're going to go to a party. Why don't you go to this party with us? And so it really started out in terms of them going back to a party and partying, and then they found out a lot about him. And then eventually he, through drugs and alcohol and other things, he actually ended up being prostituted. Involved in that are rapes and other things that they do to quote unquote break them. But that was that was his path. So each person who has a vulnerability, they have a different path there. At some point, you know, a lot of times, you know, rapes and beatings are applied to quote unquote break them. And so even if they quote unquote go willingly, to get them to the point of where they're out on the street being sold is there's usually a lot of violence associated with it.
Okay. All right. Let's see. I guess let's see.
Yeah, one other question.
Sure.
More
You
questions?
didn't have one, Chicago. Yeah, I had one other one. You mentioned labor. What was it? You used the word. It was labor something. Labor. Say it again. I'm sorry.
Labor trafficking.
Okay. Yeah. So with the labor trafficking, is it pertaining to using them for work, or like how we see people working in warehouses and they make, you know, low minimum, like we know like in China they have the warehouses where
Sweatshops.
don't make a lot of sweatshops. There we go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Couldn't get it out. So is that pertaining to something similar to that, or?
Yeah, labor trafficking, there's probably a couple of different things that we see, particularly here. There are probably a couple of different things that we see. In terms of labor trafficking, yeah, you could be talking about, you know, labor in factories and things like that. It could be restaurants, right? So, and that's what's really hard about labor trafficking, is that you don't really, it's really hard to see. Like we know what prostitution and sex work is, and we kind of know where it happens. But in terms of labor trafficking, if you're talking about, well, you've got a restaurant here, you know, do you know if the person clearing the tables is getting paid? Do you know if somebody working in the kitchen or sweeping up, if they're getting paid? No, you don't. You know, so, you know, we've seen restaurants, construction. So do you know if the guy cleaning up after the construction work or taking out stuff and throwing it away, if he's getting paid? You hope so. But you don't know. And usually those situations really require someone to say something. And that can be really hard. But one thing we do and is we like to talk about, you know, we like to talk about fair trade a little bit, and I can do that. There's a website. It's called slaveryfootprint.org. And if you go there, you kind of take their little survey about what you buy and how much you buy and that sort of thing. And it'll tell you really how many kind of the level of your purchases that involve slave labor. And so So your kind of slavery footprint. And it's really kind of eye-opening to do. We tell people to be cognizant of when you're purchasing things. The truth is it's very hard to tell. So for example, two areas where there's a lot of human trafficking involved are chocolate, and I'm saying that, I know I'm saying that on Halloween, chocolate and coffee. So there's a lot of human trafficking. Now, if you buy fair trade chocolate or fair trade coffee, then you can be pretty assured that there's been no slavery involved in the making of the product. But it's really hard to tell. So there's clothing can be made in sweatshops in different parts of the world that are under slave labor. There are, other products both in and out of the U.S. that can be made with slave labor. Now, here in the United States, we have many laws that are supposed to prevent that, it's certainly not the same extent as other countries who don't have those laws or don't force them. But we tell people to be careful or not be careful. If you're interested in fair trade, that's something to look into. There are fair trade stores online. There are fair trade in a lot of grocery stores now. You can kind of read on the little boxes. It'll say if it's fair trade. I think it's Paul Newman. Some of Paul Newman's stuff, like the coffee and other stuff that he does, has the fair trade symbol on them. So a lot of companies are doing that. You can also go online if you've got a favorite retailer. A lot of times they'll tell you where their human rights policies. And so we tell people, if you're really interested, you can go and look at where you're buying goods from to see what their human rights policies are. There have been companies that put a lot of effort into making sure that their supply chains are slave-free. Others don't at all. But labor trafficking here in the United States, usually what we're seeing are restaurants, farming sometimes, construction, sales crews. So somebody goes to, a young person knocks on your door and they kind of flash something. They say they're trying to make money to go to college. And so you're thinking, okay, great, I'll buy something because you want to go to college. Well, a lot of times those are not necessarily legitimate situations. And so you have to be careful there. We tell people to buy from people, either people or organizations you're familiar with. We have local high school band every year comes around, knocks on the door and asks for money. So we always give them money. But we've had sales crews run through here before in our neighborhood, and typically it's a young person. They are typically not dressed appropriate for the weather. So maybe they're dressed and they should have a jacket on and they don't. There's maybe a car kind of down the street who somebody's watching them. Oh, that's my dad. That's not your dad. I know that, but anyway, those sales crews are pretty common too. Those are the ones we tell people. It's probably one where you might be able to say, oh, that's probably a fishy situation. So again, labor trafficking is out there, hard to spot. Here in the United States, it's usually not factories. Not saying it couldn't happen, but a lot of times it's in the industries I just mentioned. So.
Okay. Michelle, you mind telling us a little bit about your the organization that you're a part of?
Yeah, we started in 2000. We had our first meeting in 2013 at a local church, and it was after probably a year of God just throwing this circumstance into just in front of me. And finally, I realized that, we needed to kind of figure out, is it an issue here? That was probably the biggest question that I had, and anybody I ran into and talked to about it. Is it an issue here? And, we're in Fredericksburg, Virginia. It's a nice place to live. It really is a nice place to live here. But, the question is, did it happen here? So I remember talking to my husband, and he said, you know what, let's find out. So we made an appointment with our local sheriff's office to talk to somebody. I was actually surprised they would be willing to talk to me about it. My husband was going to go with me, but he couldn't. He had a work thing. And so I went over myself, and I thought, okay, they're going to just kind of tell me it's not a problem, and they're going to usher me out, and, and I'll feel better about it. And there's probably part of me that really wanted him to say it's not a problem here. But that didn't happen. I was in his office for over an hour, and he's talking about the types of trafficking we have here, and oh, we're so glad somebody in the community is concerned about it. And he had little graphs and other things he was showing me, and I'm like, wow. And so I asked him where it was happening, and he was explaining where it was happening, and it just stuck in my head when he said the mall. Now, it wasn't the only place he mentioned, but the mall was where it just stuck in my head. So I left, and thanked him for his time, and I left, and I got in the car, and the phone rang. It was my husband, and I'm driving towards the mall. And my husband says, how'd it go? And I told him, I said, wow, I just kind of rattled off all these things. And I said, and I'm going to the mall. And he said, Michelle, no good can come of that. No good can possibly come of you charging into the mall. You're not going to know what you want to do when you get there, but you're going to be fired up. So he said, why don't you go home, and we'll sit down and we'll talk about it. So we did. And then later, a friend of mine and I decided that we were going to have a lunch and have some speakers. So we had the person I spoke to and invited some other speakers. And then that's really where the whole thing started. And so we had our first meeting in 2013. We incorporated in 2014, and got our nonprofit status, and then really started moving from there. And we really started with awareness, because if you don't know you have a problem, you can't do anything about it. And then we then moved on to prevention and vocational education, legislative advocacy, because we didn't have a standalone human trafficking law here at the time. And then we spent 2 years trying to figure out, well, how do we help victims of trafficking, and how do we do it so that we can be successful? Because a lot of people say build a shelter. Well, one, that costs a lot of money, and if you don't really know what you're doing or the clientele, you can actually end up making a bigger mess, lack of a better, because there have been shelters that have failed because they didn't really understand what they were getting into. And and when you do that, you fail the community, you fail the victims, you fail everybody who wanted to help you, and then you make it harder for anybody who comes behind you. So from our perspective, we tried to do a study, and then we decided that we're not going to do a shelter at this time. We're going to try to help victims and connect them with resources within the community or even outside of the community. And so we built a nice network and collaborate a lot with other organizations within our community to try to work with victims of trafficking. We try to identify them and work with them. The one thing we don't do is we don't do any we don't go and try to do rescues. That's what law enforcement's there for. That's not what we're there for. Those are really dangerous
Yeah.
situations. So,
Yeah.
so we've been just gradually adding. This year we're focusing with COVID. We haven't had as many speaking engagements, so we've actually focused a little bit more on not just our clients, but also on research and things like that. So we're focusing now on how do we get at demand, because it's both a supply and demand issue. Somebody's buying, and so we have to focus on that as well. And the truth is because there are so many minors that are being bought, there are what's the really uncomfortable thing is that there are adults out there willing to buy them, and they're willing
Yes.
to convince themselves that their desires are greater than that child who they know probably doesn't want to be in that situation. And so we need to figure out how to get at that. So some of that's education, but some of it is going to be law as well.
Yes. Okay. Well, I thank you so much for speaking and informing us about human, sex trafficking and labor trafficking as well. With labor trafficking. Thank you very much for giving us that information. I just am appreciative of the information that you've shared with us and making us aware of, so basically the signs that you look for are the same signs you will look for, I guess, physical abuse or emotional abuse.
Yeah.
Or financial abuse, the same things.
Yeah, and so we certainly, depending upon your vocation, like a doctor may see certain things that, somebody in the hotel motel industry may see something different. But yeah, a lot of times it looks like abuse.
Yes.
Now, some of it looks like extreme abuse, but a lot of it looks like abuse. A lot of times, general things, they may, folks may not understand. They may not understand the time of day because they're not sleeping probably normally. They're maybe functioning more at night. They may not really understand what time of day it is. If they're actually moving them, we live on the I-95 corridor, so that's a big area. They may not even know where they physically are in the country or in the state. They may not be able to tell you, oh, I'm in Fredericksburg, Virginia. They may not even realize they're in Virginia. So there again, there are different signs. Malnutrition, because they're not eating very well. We had one young lady who said that if she made her quota, she got to pick something off of the dollar menu at McDonald's. So if you think about a long period of time, how malnourished somebody would be. So there are a lot of things, but they could also look like something else. And so that's what makes this very difficult to spot.
Oh, yes. Yes. Okay. Well, it's time for us to, we're at the end of our podcast. Thank everyone for participating on our podcast, and I'm sure some of you all will view it later. If you have any questions, feel free to call our call line 256-669-9565 for further information. Thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us.
Okay, if you have any other questions, just you have my information. So.
Okay, thank you, Dawana
You're welcome.
Thank Tanya too, even though she
Thank you.
signed off. Yes. So thank you all for joining, and we will be back with our next episode in 2 weeks. And we will be on discriminatory abuse, on that portion of our topic. So today we covered modern day slavery. Next 2 weeks. This is a bi-weekly podcast. We will talk about discriminatory abuse. Thank you all for joining us. Again, have a blessed night.
Bye.
Okay, I'm gonna end our live.